the new emphases in research, and what research is important to our economic future. The traditional structure of peer evaluation for research does not lead to dealing with the basic question, what kind of research does our country want and need? What kind of research should we emphasize, especially at a time of changing national needs? Many of us, I'm certainly one of them, are absolutely unabashed in giving talks about the role that research plays in fostering economic development. It tends to be a simplistic argument, but there are some real truths in this. And I do this in the attempt to convince political leaders, leaders of our state, of the need for additional funds at our university. But there is another important truth, and that is not all research is practical, and even if it were, we can't tell how it will be all the time. This American research enterprise has stood largely on the high ground of the pursuit of truth and a larger public interest during this post-World War II growth and research support. It is not clear to me that research universities in our community can compete with other political forces if we step down from this high ground position. The political arena is slippery ground, and it's an arena in which there are winners and losers. Research fraud is a second issue that I find troubling. There is clear evidence of people fabricating data. There is evidence of senior scientists forcing their junior colleagues to include them on work to which they have made no significant contribution. There is evidence of reviewers stealing ideas from proposals, and there are evidence of funds being spent for their unintended purposes, facilities being used for private gain. There's a wonderful article in Nature about the response of the biological system to an antibody that isn't there. More horribly, David Baltimore, arguably one of our great biologists, Nobel laureate, was put on the defensive in the public arena when it was claimed that the results were falsified in a paper that he supervised. Initially, Baltimore blamed the whistleblower, but in time was embarrassed when it was shown clearly that the study had been in fact falsified. Third, there is this debate that's still raging about indirect cost charges of major research universities. The first victim of this debate was Stanford University. Don Kennedy, the president of that university, appeared before Representative Dingell's subcommittee in Washington. This probe has been extended to other universities, and I believe ultimately affects all of us. It has resulted in Kennedy's resignation. It's yet another arrow from the political arena. The treatment of Kennedy was very tough and typically political. I believe it is indicated, at least in that arena, that universities have become fair game. We are not considered different or distinctive because of our roles. We're just like the rest, seeking federal funds. The standards that are applied are largely political standards, not legal standards, and they're based on what can stand public scrutiny. I believe this debate about indirect cost has hurt all of us. It has not been a good thing, and it illustrates that this federal government that we have grown used to as the supporter of our research can be very fickle when it serves the political interests. The danger in all of this, I believe, is that it undermines the public's confidence in this research enterprise. Much of what we do at a university in research today is beyond the understanding of the public, even the educated public. They have to accept its value and its validity largely as a matter of faith. They must trust us. And when that faith is destroyed, the entire enterprise suffers, and I believe that could be quite unfortunate. So as members of a research university, as scholars, we have a very serious need to be vigilant and to have a commitment to honesty, and where there is fraud or inappropriate behavior, we must step up to it quickly and decisively. The fourth challenge, and I believe the one that is important, maybe perhaps most important, is this perceived tension between research and teaching at the modern research university, and I believe it must be addressed. Make no mistake, I include myself among those who accept the complementary nature of teaching and research as an article of faith. In fact, I not only believe it, I have seen it. I have seen it in my own career and in that of others. And what I mean by the tension between teaching and research, I don't mean the trivial idea that people are either good researchers or good teachers, and that good research is somehow antithetical to good teaching. These are old arguments that are often advanced by people who do neither teaching nor research well, and they do not deserve a careful response. My concern has to do with the real tensions that grow out of the time pressures that are inherent in the multifaceted responsibilities that faculty have in research universities and the specialization that is required to advance the state of the art in these various areas. Let me try to elaborate. To the extent that the demands on faculty for teaching and research and service grow, there are trade-offs of time. It's inevitable, and they must occur. There's no escaping it. If there's a perception by faculty and others, even if it is incorrect, that research is more important, teaching may suffer. Not because the faculty can't do the teaching well, it will be because of time. And the heightened competition for support, for proposals, means more time writing proposals, more trips to sponsors, more time. And that time can be taken away from efforts to enhance teaching. My experience, my observation, is that the impact on teaching is not typically in the classroom, but it's outside of class, where opportunities to counsel with individual students, advising discussions, the kind of informal interactions with students, particularly with undergraduates, is what really suffers as a result. I was shocked by a study by Yankelovich, Skelly and others, a national public opinion survey firm a few years ago did a study for a major research university of public opinion leaders in the United States. And they found that a substantial majority of these public opinion leaders believed that undergraduates do not benefit from studying at a research university. These people saw no obvious synergism between the research activities of the university on the one hand and undergraduate instruction on the other. If this notion that teaching and research are complementary, the idea that I accept as an article of faith and fundamental to the concept of a research university, then we've got some important opinion leaders to convince otherwise. I find this notion that there is not this complementarity to these two parts of our mission very dangerous, very troubling. We've got to change this view. We've got to do this to command the resources we need to carry out this enterprise. Another, and for me, equally troubling aspect of this tension of time and between teaching and research and its impact and specialization is impact on the curriculum. To advance knowledge through research today requires a depth of understanding that often leads to specialization. It is in the nature of the knowledge that's about us. This specialization is institutionalized through the departmental structure that I talked about earlier. This specialization makes the discussion of curriculum issues among the faculty extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. I have seen this with my own colleagues, even within departments. I had the privilege, I guess it was a privilege once, of chairing a curriculum committee to review the curriculum. And what intrigued me is that as we debated this further and further, it was clearly balkanized and bartered. It was an aerospace engineering curriculum, but the people who were interested in the thermal sciences said to those who were interested in structures, give us our 3 courses, we'll work that out, we'll let you have your 3. The people in thermal sciences had absolutely nothing to say about structures, and the structures people had absolutely nothing to say about the thermal sciences. And it's not just within departments. Not many of my engineering colleagues are aware of what is happening in literature today. Mathematicians know little of biology. Biologists know little of mathematics. There is this specialization that makes very difficult a debate about education, particularly general education. I believe part of the message of this assessment movement that is in the country and is beginning to overtake universities is that this historic responsibility that the faculty have had in setting the curriculum is not being fulfilled as effectively as people would like. In the absence of some broader understanding, then the faculty, and I include myself in this, are unable to talk meaningfully about liberal education or general education. We each know our specialties, and we are very reluctant to tread in the domain of other experts. This results, I believe, in a smorgasbord of courses, one from here, one from there, a kind of balkanization of the curriculum. And although it often doesn't add up to a real education, a good general education. In my own field of engineering, I believe it is one of the reasons we don't do manufacturing well. Hardly anybody knows the whole system. We only know pieces of it. Well, how are we going to deal with these kinds of issues? I believe it is essential that the universities try to deal with these, because if we don't, others will. And worse, this wonderful enterprise that we have pledged our careers to could be jeopardized. I'd like to argue that in tackling these issues, we start with the most fundamental first, and that is to ensure that this kind of university, a research university in which teaching, research, and public service define our mission, that in fact these various aspects of our mission really do complement each other in a way that enriches our students, particularly our undergraduate students, and in a way that the public that supports us understands, comprehends, and supports. We must be true to this land-grant mission. To do this, I believe, for example, we have to find ways to integrate teaching and research for undergraduate students as well as graduate students. I am a proponent of research opportunities for credit for undergraduates. That's one approach. Bringing current research into the classroom is yet another. Term projects that provide opportunities for students to review new research opportunities, yet a third. Integrating research and public service through some of these problem-oriented research centers is another means for bringing this integration together. Taking advantage of some of these multidisciplinary research centers we have as a way to bring both graduate and undergraduate students into this marriage of teaching, research, and service is yet another example. And I believe it is essential for the faculty to try to find ways, forums, for educating each other about our various disciplines. We have to gain the knowledge necessary for an informed debate about the curriculum. This is fundamentally important. It is the faculty's responsibility. Among the organizations of a university that could do that is Sigma Xi. It is one of the organizations that does transcend the disciplines. It brings together people from a variety of areas. It provides a vehicle for organizing this discussion for the mutual education of us all. But it will take time and it will take energy. It might be interesting. I'm convinced if we don't do it, someone else will do it for us. So I believe there must be an integration or a better blending of the teaching and research and service missions of our university, particularly as they affect undergraduate education, and we had better find and value those people who make this kind of integration work well. In fact, if we don't know how to figure out how to do this blending of teaching, research, and service more effectively, all three of those missions will suffer ultimately. It is in this sense that I think we should recommit to the total land-grant mission that defines this university. It really is what we say we are, and my sense as I visit around Iowa and read what is going on nationally and visit with others, it's also what's needed. In Clark Kerr's paper that I mentioned earlier, he quotes Robert Louis Stevenson, who said, "To travel hopefully is a better thing than to arrive." And Kerr says, "It might almost be said that the perfect university is an imperfect one seeking perfection." I believe that blending teaching, research, and service in a way that complement each other better is this search for perfection that is what we should aspire to. They cannot stand alone. They must combine to benefit each other and provide the kind of opportunity that will provide the best educational opportunities for all of our students. On that, I would be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Christie. Anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? He is opening himself up to that opportunity. We're becoming more like private institutions in some senses, aren't we? Students are paying a higher percent of their costs. I'm reading that the extension service, if people want extension services, having to pay some for it. Is this all a good direction?
It's
Comments?
I believe it's complex. There are a number of things happening. First, as we try to do more, for example, in building this much more substantial research enterprise here at Iowa State, which has happened at other institutions, we have done that largely by expanding our resource base. And so we have engaged particularly the federal government, but more recently there has been more support for research from the private sector, as happened in a number of universities around the country, so that the sources of income have become more varied, and some of them are private. We have become more aggressive in trying to create special opportunities on the campus through private funding from our alumni and other friends. The Durham Center, recreation facility, those are examples of that. But also, there is a trend, I believe, in the country, and it concerns me, I'll tell you why in a second, of seeing the fruits of education being visited largely upon the individuals who are here at the university, largely upon our students, and less upon the society generally. I have this sense that the explanation for the movement from grants to loans, at the federal level in terms of student financial aid, the increasing willingness all over the country to increase tuition far faster than inflation. The University of California's tuition went up 40% this year. The University of Missouri system has committed itself to increasing tuition for students at the Higher Education Price Index plus $200 per year for 5 consecutive years. Take tuition from $2,000 to $4,000 a year. The University of Texas system has instituted tuition in the last few years. There is a general tendency to place a larger fraction of the burden on students. And I believe underlying this is a view that they are the primary beneficiaries and they ought to bear a larger fraction of the cost. This question of what the balance is between the private interests of students as individuals, being educated, being given opportunities, having their lives enriched as individuals, and the impact of education generally on the society is a serious question, and it ebbs and flows in terms of how we perceive that balance. But if there is something fundamental to the land-grant idea, it was this faith, this notion that if we all invested publicly in this kind of university, we would all benefit from this kind of university. And I am therefore troubled by this larger trend nationally. It troubles me. To personalize this, I couldn't have gotten through school without public support. The oldest of 6 kids from a very ordinary working class family. It just simply wouldn't have been possible to finance my education, and my parents had to sign a check, or I had to, or together we couldn't have done it. So I'm concerned about that. The tension for this university and others as funding gets tighter. The resources we have are relatively limited. Appropriations from state government, number 1, tuition and fees, number 2. Much of the other funding we receive, for example, for research, is restricted funding. It has a specific target that it's intended for, and we can't use it for these more general purposes. Whether that indicates the movement towards privatizing the university or not, that's perhaps stronger than I would state it. But I believe this is a serious debate. It's a debate taking place in Iowa as well as elsewhere. To the extent that we will be true to these land-grant ideas, I think we will continue to try to find ways to mitigate against that so that students who are able, but not necessarily financially able or intellectually able, will still have the opportunity. It's a challenge. Yes?
In your opinion, do you think students have the kind of voice that they need to be able to give their input to the kinds of things you were talking about, for example, curriculum, or into the research opportunities that, you know, granted would help them quite a bit in their education?
Yeah. And I would argue that on a couple of grounds. First, a question of who ought to make the judgments about curriculum, and I believe the most learned among us should, and that argues for the faculty having the primary responsibility. It's historically been true at universities. And second, given the 3,500 colleges and universities in the United States, there is wide choice of the different kinds of curriculums and programs of instruction that people can choose from. So there's lots of variety out there. I don't think choice for students is limited. My concern is, as we become specialists as faculty, that assuring that this balance between a practical and often specialized education on the one hand, and a liberal general education on the other, which is another basic idea of these land-grant universities, becomes increasingly difficult to achieve because we don't have the basis for having the debate about what the general curriculum should be. We don't know enough about the general curriculum. Concerns me. Yeah.
I have a question about, you mentioned those three areas that are of importance to you, service, research, and teaching. And in the advancement or in gaining tenure for an individual faculty member, I was wondering, we can assess research, we can look at it and we can see if an individual is contributing. Do you have any thoughts on how a person or how the university can assess advancements or effectiveness in teaching and service?
Sure. Let me speak specifically to teaching, because my view is that you can quantitatively measure both research and teaching. You can count papers, you can count proposals, you can count invited talks. More difficult questions deal with the qualitative aspects of research. How significant is it? How enduring? And those are judgments ultimately that have to be made by peers, and they're imprecise but important. Similarly in teaching, you can count the number of students, you can count the number of courses taught, you can count the number of courses developed, or textbooks written, or papers written. The qualitative aspects of effective teaching are more difficult to measure. I believe, in my own experience, that students are a useful source of information on this, and I have been a proponent of student evaluations. I believe they ought to be confidential because I believe the basic thrust ought to be to improve teaching. I think students have lots of effective ways of finding out how teachers are. There's a network that was very effective when I was a student, and I have all kinds of reasons to believe it remains effective. But the deeper questions, not only of whether the students have learned material and are prepared for yet the next course, and are achieving in some narrow sense the growth of knowledge, but harder questions about whether they have had their appetite whetted intellectually, and whether they leave this university not only educated but prepared to continue to be educated, whether they have been inspired a bit. Those are more difficult things to judge, and again, I tend to turn to the peers. But I think you can evaluate both. Service, similarly. More difficult questions are questions of the quality of the activity. I also believe that even when it's difficult to measure these things and to assess them, that the only worst thing is to not even try. Because in doing so, you say it's not very important. So I argue for comprehensive, multifaceted measures, and rely heavily on the peers, but not exclusively. I believe particularly in teaching, the students ought to play a role in that, if only to say to them that we really are serious about this.
Yeah. I think you're aware there's a continuing debate about land-grant universities in terms of where they, what audience should they serve? Are they an elitist organization or are they an egalitarian organization or institution? And this refers to economic considerations as well as to intellectual considerations. And this begins to surface perhaps in the intellectual area when one debates entrance requirements,
Sure.
for example, or as one begins to design a curriculum, as one begins to work in other opportunities. How would you respond to the question or the statement that the view that you're proposing seems to favor the elitist side rather than the egalitarian side?
I don't think I agree with the conclusion. If that's the impression you have gotten, I have not communicated very effectively. In terms of our history, there's just no question that the land-grant universities were an instrument of public policy to expand access. That's clear. And it succeeded. Succeeded admirably, I believe. In a real world of limited resources, the question of how effectively one uses those resources in creating access is a real challenge. I believe that universities should have admission standards, not so much for elitist reasons, but I believe it most deeply because I think we need to give students some indication of what is required for success. I was of an era and went to an institution where in my first course in chemistry, the professor gave that old cliche about look to the left and look to the right. I find that a bankrupt idea. I believe we ought to have admission standards so that students come to us with some reasonable expectation that if they apply themselves, they will succeed. And for those who don't have the requisite background or ability, that there be other avenues. I am a proponent in that sense of the community college system, of transfers. So I would argue for greater access. I don't necessarily believe that means open access to anybody, to any institution, because it's too inefficient in the use of resources. But all of my views are, I feel fairly strongly that both for the development of individuals as members of the society, for the full richness of their lives, but also for very practical reasons of where the good jobs are and what we need in the society. I argue for more people being educated. How to do that efficiently, what our role is in that system is a matter for serious discussion and debate. I don't have much quarrel with the current entrance standard that says if you graduate, I believe, in the upper half of your class in Iowa, you're admitted to the university. It seems to me to be a relatively open, liberal admission standard. And for those who don't meet that, there are yet other ways that they can ultimately gain access to this university. I would argue for that. I think the notion that issues of efficiency aren't serious and important questions, I just don't agree with that. Frankly, under the current circumstances, they have taken on a certain urgency. They are very serious questions. And how we use these precious funds, who we invest them in, who is accorded this opportunity, I think is a very important question. So I'm not sure I agree with the conclusion you made.
I think perhaps I stated that poorly as a conclusion, but it seems to me that in saying that you're going to be very efficient and serve students with a particular background, and at the same time, the national trend is perhaps increasing costs. Are we moving more from the egalitarian concept towards the elitist?
I think that's why I am troubled by this trend of putting a greater share of the burden on students. I think one of the dangers in this is that we could make it increasingly difficult for students who have the ability but don't have the resources. That troubles me. And I don't have a simple answer for it because I believe the basic question, the deepest issue, is a public policy question of how do we view this public enterprise? Do we view it as something for all of us, to which we all contribute and from which we all benefit? Or do we see it largely as an enterprise whose benefits are visited only upon those who come here? The These institutions were not created, in my view, for the students or the faculty or the administration. They were created as instruments of public policy to advance the interests of the larger society. That's why we have public universities. That's what Morrill's Act was all about. And I'm just suggesting that today we're revisiting that question a bit, and one could interpret the trends nationally and where the costs are being borne as a questioning of that. I would lend my voice